So, okay, I wanted to talk about this because this actually was on my radar last week, but we never got to it. But not even necessarily the specifics of it, but just the kind of general idea that is very creepy, which is something we've touched on a little bit in the past. But it's this new term, relatively new over the last few years. We never really needed a term for it before, and it is debanking. I don't know if you saw, Rob, that Nigel Farage was recently debanked. And I evidently there's been some recourse for that. I think someone from the bank actually was resigned over it, and it looks like he might be getting that back. But of course, this was a major factor in the freedom protests in Canada a couple years back. This has been a major thing with political dissidents, however you want to phrase it, people who have gotten their banks shut down. This has happened in America to several people, and obviously in Canada and here in the UK. You know, I first found Nigel Farage back in the day when I first became a libertarian. There was this website called the Daily Paul, which was it just every day had updates about the latest Ron Paul speech or the latest Ron Paul event or the latest article. And then it just had other kind of things in that world. And people kept posting these videos of this guy, Nigel Farage. And they were like, yo, this guy's like the UK version of Ron Paul, which was not exactly true. He was not a pure libertarian like that, but he was fighting for Brexit all the way back then. And he really was the lone voice on talking about how England should secede from the European Union. And it was very cool at the time. That had no popular support at the time. He was just out there constantly giving speeches about, I think he was in the European Parliament at one point, and he would just be giving speeches about how awful and authoritarian they all are, and how dare you guys have the right to set, regulations for that, for supposedly sovereign countries and stuff. And it was amazing that this actually worked, and he won. And so there was something just I found really fascinating about the guy, where it's at the time, the idea of England leaving the EU, I mean, look, it's not quite like a secession in the United States, but it seemed fairly close, something that seemed so daunting to actually achieve. And they did it. So that always kind of made him an interesting figure to me. But evidently he was debanked over political views that he held. This is something that is it's a truly, truly creepy precedent to set. It is one thing to get kicked off of social media companies. That's pretty creepy too. It's one thing to kind of get fired from your job or something like that, but to actually have the bank shut down your bank account seems like it's almost like, oh, you wouldn't even need political assassinations anymore. You could just have some type of system of debanking. And particularly when, you had things like the trucker protests in Canada, and this was their go-to for that, was okay, well, we'll shut down your bank accounts, and then let's see how much, how much fight you got left in you there when you don't know how you're going to get groceries tomorrow. And the fact that this has already happened in America to several people strictly because of their political views being unpopular, obviously for anybody who values liberty, especially in a political setting where that's not the popular position, and particularly during a time of a crisis, it's never popular. Man, this is a pretty creepy thing that we ought to think about.
There's this, you ever watch, there was a show called The Venture Brothers? I don't know if you ever came across that.
No, I never saw it.
It was a very odd Cartoon Network cartoon that was one of my favorite comedies at one point. And I played this on Run Your Mouth a little while back, but there's a sequence where there's cartoonish villains in that show. And one of the villains had this scheme where he was going to make a name illegal. And the reason he was going to make the name illegal was because it was the name of his nemesis. And he went on this tirade about how if the name was legal, the guy couldn't sign paperwork. He couldn't access his money from the bank. Essentially, he would be depersoned. And it was a very easy way to just ruin someone's life very humorously. But it was funny to me that that's now what they're doing to people. And that, yeah, it's annoying. It sucks if all of a sudden I get strikes on my YouTube channel, which actually just happened last week. It sucks. You can't make money. You can't grow your platform. You're limiting your audience. It sucks. It's not as bad as not having access to my bank account where, I don't know, how am I paying my insurance bill? Do I got to show up to the office in person? Do I have to like lose days out of my week to start figuring out who will actually even take cash payments from me? I mean, think about like, I don't know, can you get a credit card without having a bank account? I know mine is through Chase and Visa. Right. I would imagine you can't. But then what happens? I can't rent hotel rooms, or I have to have $20,000 in cash every time as a deposit, and then I got to trust that they're going to give that back to me. You're looking at, and I mean, this all plays into kind of the idea of what they might be able to do if like they're tracking us on our phones with mandatory health passports or other technologies, or, you know, central backed digital currencies and the ability to just turn you off from your money at any point in time. And it all comes back to even just the fact that we don't live in a free world where someone can just open up a bank. That doesn't exist. I can't just open up a bank. I have to be part of the big players in the big system. And there are new alternative technologies, which, like, God bless Elon Musk that he might have his own digital infrastructure with his satellites and Twitter and maybe even like a payment platform so that there actually is a free enterprise and we'll be able to, you know, at least interact with other people if everything goes to shit and they start throwing everyone off every other platform. You know what I mean? Like that there would be an infrastructure. But I don't know if people quite realize what it means to have the possibility that the government can just say, and this guy was a big enough politician that he was able to, you know, people were able to find out about it. If that were to happen, let's just say you and I were only comedians and we didn't have the large podcast and we made some joke in a club that the government decided they didn't like, and so we're being debanked. Where do you go? Who do you tell? You become a crazy guy in your street corner yelling about how the government took your money, and everyone's like, well, what is that guy talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, of course, from the libertarian perspective, I think how we tend to look at this and go kind of what you were getting at, that it's like, well, look, these rules are all set up to basically consolidate banking power. So there's very few big banks. This would be much better. A great solution to this would be to say, just allow for, like, look, the market would have broken up all of these big banks back in 2008. And you know what I mean? You'd have many more options. It would be much more difficult to get you debanked from every bank. You know, like, one of the scary things now is that there's only so many big banks that you're like, oh, so it's, you know, if they convince the 5 to debank you, then you're kind of like almost not a person in modern world anymore. You've really been unpersoned. There wouldn't be 5. There would be 70, you know what I mean? If we had more of a free market, and it'd be much more difficult to convince all of them. You also wouldn't have the fact, you know, people say, oh, well, you can go to these other, you know, you can go to some of these smaller banks or credit unions or things like that. The problem is that those institutions don't get preferential treatment from the Federal Reserve. And so you're much less protected in many ways in those banks. So there's lots of issues like that. However, I don't think it's unreasonable for libertarians to say, short of a free market in banking, which we're pretty damn far from, you know, short of like tearing apart the whole Federal Reserve structure, which obviously would be the ideal solution, that this just should be illegal. It just should be illegal for banks to debank someone over their political views. And I'm sorry, I mean, you can make it, you know, in the same way that it should be illegal for you to like leave the Senate and then go work for Raytheon and get paid $100 million a year. Like, it's, yes, ideally we would just not have the government, you know what I mean, like funneling money into Raytheon. But given that we do, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. And given that basically all of these big banks have been propped up by the taxpayer and by the US dollar, if they're going to take that type of government assistance, they absolutely, like, it really does seem like it's kind of necessary. Like, the First Amendment really means nothing if you can't be protected in some way that, you know what I mean? Like, certainly at the very least, the government should not be allowed to, you know, communicate with big tech companies and request censorship of people. They shouldn't be able to request that from banks. And I would even go further and say these big banks that are all completely, essentially government institutions, they should not be allowed. They should be forced to respect the First Amendment.